Welcome everyone to our caucus on climate migration, immigration, and human rights. We're delighted you're joining us today to hear more about how these critical issues intersect. Let me start with some introductions. First, the caucus organizers are Claudia Keith and Kathy Frischman from the League of Women Voters of Oregon and Jill Follows from the League of Women Voters of Fairfax, Virginia. I'm Kathleen Montgomery from the League of Women Voters in Orange Coast in California, and I'll be your moderator today. I'd also like to acknowledge our technical experts from the League of Women Voters of Oregon who've provided expert support in preparing for this caucus and who will be standing by to assist us in case we need help this afternoon. This is Amanda Crittenden, Oregon's Office Support Specialist, and Sarah Andrews, Oregon's Office Coordinator. Thank you both. Also, as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and anything posted on the Q&A will also be included in that recording. And the recordings will be shared on League websites for educational purposes following the convention. Okay, so this is who we are: Claudia, Kathy, Jill, and myself. And these is just a preview of who our four distinguished speakers will be, but I will have something to say about each one when we get to that part of our presentation. So let's start by highlighting why this caucus is so important today in 2020. Among all the pressing issues in our country right now, the League's board has identified 5 urgent issues as priorities. Now, I note that these were agreed upon before 2 more issues pushed so much else off the table, that being the pandemic and racial justice. And I'm sure there'll be much more said about these 2 issues later in the convention. But today we're going to focus on 2 of the 5 urgent issues: immigration and climate change. And in the panel on the left, I've briefly summarized the League's positions on each of these issues from the League's document, Impact on Issues. And our goal today is to amplify awareness of the connection between these issues: climate change, climate migration, immigration, and human rights. And here's our plan for the caucus today. We'll hear from 4 distinguished speakers and then have an opportunity for Q&A following that. And we'll conclude by presenting a resolution on immigration that's been proposed by the Oregon League and will be voted on later this week in the convention. So let me begin by highlighting what we all already know, that climate change and the inevitable climate migration that it will provoke is one of the biggest challenges of our time. This has been recognized by a wealth of scientists and international bodies, including the International Organization for Migration and the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. And at its heart, it is indeed a human rights issue, as tens of millions of people are predicted to become climate migrants or climate refugees by the middle of this century, which is not all that far away, triggering an unimaginable humanitarian crisis. People's basic human rights, access to clean water, food, housing, healthcare, and self-determination will be threatened by climate change and climate migration. And people will need help for rebuilding their lives within a framework that preserves these basic human rights. And this is where the Universal Declaration of Human Rights stands tall, as a foundational document that articulates a common, albeit aspirational, standard of achievement of human rights for all peoples. So let me give you a bit of background about this wonderful document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is said to be the most widely translated document in the world. It was adopted by the UN in 1948 as one of the first actions by the newly constituted United Nations following World War II. And it serves as the foundation for numerous subsequent UN conventions that address particular areas of human rights, including civil and political rights, and economic, social, and cultural rights, and also the rights of specific categories of individuals. And these conventions have been adopted by the UN and ratified by countries across the globe. And among the various conventions is the International Convention on the Protection of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families. So In this 100th anniversary of the founding of the League of Women Voters and the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, we can be proud of the role that women played in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The document was drafted by the first UN Human Rights Commission, which was chaired by former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a longtime member of the League of Women Voters and strong advocate of the League's work. And even in the 40s, as the document was drafted, women delegates to the commission managed to change some key wording in the document from the male default style of language of the day. For example, in the preamble, instead of saying equal rights, the preamble declares faith in the equal rights of men and women, not just men, and that all human beings are born free, not just all men are born free. And it's surprising, but there were fights to get that language changed. So we're very proud of that having been accomplished. Through various avenues, the League of Women Voters has continued its strong interest in and commitment to promoting human rights. And one key group is the Human Rights Special Interest Group, which was formed in 2018 by a group of League members from across the country who were inspired by Eleanor Roosevelt's visionary human rights agenda. And our first project was a 2019-2020 briefing book on human rights, synergy between policies of the League of Women Voters and the United Nations Human Rights Conventions. And this book has been posted already on several League websites around the country, and you can also access it through the link included in the resource packet that came along with this conference, or this caucus. Okay, now it's time to hear from our panelists. I'd like to hold questions until all four of our panelists have had a chance to talk. Our first speaker is Linda Wasenik, a longtime leader in the League of Women Voters, who will speak about her work on problems that our immigration system is currently experiencing and how issues of immigration intersect with climate change and human rights.
Thank you. You know, sometimes when we're focused on one issue, we fail to recognize its intersectionality with other issues. This is especially true, I think, for immigration, human rights, and climate change. David Love, a Philadelphia-based writer, commentator in journalism and media professor, said, "Climate change threatens economic disaster with widespread hunger and displacement, but also human rights catastrophe and a threat to democracy and civil and political rights. Climate change is disrupting things all over the world. Just one example is Central America. Countries like Guatemala that have mountain ranges on the Atlantic and Pacific coast with the fertile valley in the middle. However, multi-year drought has caused the crops to fail, and families cannot feed themselves, nor can they raise enough crop to sell for income. There's an increase in domestic violence and child abuse. Gangs are emerging. In addition, people are leaving because they can't make a living, and they don't want to become, their sons to become some foot soldier in a drug cartel, or their daughters to become some drug lord sex slave. Now, why do these stories offend us so much? The U.S. was founded on a principle that all men are created equal and have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Parents have a responsibility to protect their children from harm, so they set out on a journey to find a better place. They'll even send their older children by themselves because they heard that children who approach the border unaccompanied have a better chance of getting asylum if they don't have an adult with them. Measures have been taken that make life even more unpleasant after immigrants arrive in the United States. They cannot hope to realize citizenship or get a green card if they use certain public services such as food stamps, housing vouchers, Children's Health Insurance Program, or Medicaid. Around the time the League was studying immigration in 2006-2007, the rules seemed to change, and crossing the border without documentation a second time became a crime. The first time, if a person agreed to go back voluntarily, they still kept a record. The second time, that gave them the excuse to call it a crime. The immigrants were arrested and put in prison, which caused the private prison industry to grow. With beds to fill, authorities did not look favorably on setting bail or releasing immigrants to their sponsors. Well, there are problems with this approach, and one of them is that children are separated from their parents. Young children don't understand what is going on. They're put in large cages with the lights on 24/7, get fed bologna sandwiches day after day, given little education and very little physical recreation. They're traumatized, and many experience psychological damage. We don't know the level of that psychological damage that they are likely to experience, but we do know that we are teaching those immigrant children to hate America. Once the immigrant is in prison, they usually serve a term of 1.5 to 2 years at the taxpayer's expense for housing them, and then they're deported. Unfortunately, they're not provided their own lawyer. Instead, one attorney may be assigned to all 40 or 50 immigrants at a facility at the time they have one mass hearing. The attorney doesn't have any time to sit with each immigrant individually to find out any details that might help that migrant win his asylum case. And when an immigrant has an attorney, they tend to win 85 to 90% of the time in court to receive their asylum. If they don't have an attorney, they tend not to win, or win only about 10 to 15% of the time. In an effort to make seeking asylum even more difficult, the administration has instituted a new policy that people who want to apply for asylum must wait in another country to get a chance to go through the credible fear interview. There are no shelters, agencies, or programs for people to wait across the border. They stay in makeshift camps or dangerous border towns where they're vulnerable to attack, robbery, or other harm. Many of these makeshift tent camps do not have access to sanitary facilities or potable water. The adults and children have no access to health care, vaccinations, or preventive care unless volunteers provide it. There is also the issue of children who were brought to the United States by their parents when they were young. They have no legal status, no social security number to apply for college or a job. Fortunately, the courts have ruled some time back that they are allowed public education through high school. And a few states have allowed these young people to go to public universities. Texas is one of those states. They attend school in constant fear that they may be arrested and sent back to a country that they do not know. Overwhelming support exists among Americans for these dreamers, and dealing with continuing the DACA program. A CBS poll showed that 95% of Democrats, 84% of independents, and 73% of Republicans favor continuing DACA. I must also mention that there's some people who came to the United States temporarily because of a natural disaster like a hurricane or an earthquake. They have a temporary protected status. This was given to refugees from Haiti, Cuba, and Central American countries, to name a few. Some people have been in the United States for 20 to 30 years, but they're now being deported back to their native country. We know there's a problem with people coming to the United States and just staying after their visa has expired. The Trump administration is considering an executive order to stop student visas for foreign students. Now think about what a lost opportunity that is for the best and the brightest from other countries to come, some from undemocratic regimes, to experience American freedom and liberty. All of these indignities and harmful actions, rightfully outrageous, they challenge our basic notions of human rights and fairness, the right of families to stay together, the right to work and make a living wage to support a family, the right to be with one's safe in one's own home. They challenge what some believe was the promise of America to the world. The impact of climate change may cause more of us to become immigrants as sea levels rise and coastal cities become uninhabitable. The League as an organization sees immigration as a priority issue. State and local leagues are working together through the online immigration discussion group. If you want to join, just email me your name, your email, and the name of your local league, and I'll add you to the group. My email is easy to remember. It's my first name, Linda, L-I-N-D-A, and the word vote, linda.vote@gmail.com. The online discussion group allows you to post information about immigration, discuss strategies for calling attention to the problem, share program ideas or sample letters to the editor, and much more. Rising immigration numbers is a concern that we must address, but we are impeded by the fear of change. Some people fear that immigrants will bring more crime, but a study by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services in 2017 and obtained by the New York Times showed that the net fiscal impact of immigrants, refugees, over a 10-year period was $165 billion value added to the economy, and crime did not increase. In addition, the arrival of a group of immigrants to a town or city that is losing population has been found to turn around the town's economy, with refugees becoming employees and employers and consumers, buying homes, starting businesses, and paying taxes. Examples of where this has occurred include Syracuse, New York, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Glendale, California, and Decatur, Georgia. Cities and intercity networks are agitating for a greater voice in deciding the content of the Global Compact for Refugees. They are developing legislative and policy frameworks to welcome refugees and promote protection, care, and assistance. In the U.S., there are more than 100 welcoming centers that have committed to developing institutional strategies for inclusion, building leadership among new arrivals, and providing support to refugees. The city of Dallas has such a welcoming center. When you look at immigration through the lens of climate change and human rights, it's easy to see that this issue fits within a number of league positions and calls us to respond with basic human decency. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Our next speaker is Bill Holston, who serves as the Executive Director of the Human Rights Initiative of North Texas. Bill has worked tirelessly for decades, providing pro bono representation for political and religious asylum seekers. He's been recognized for his service by several organizations, including the State Bar of Texas. He'll provide some insights on the concept of asylum and the recent politics surrounding the issue.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. I want to start just to reiterate the basis for asylum law in the United States, which in fact arises out of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But specifically it says, and the UN said this in 1948, that everyone has the right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum for persecution. And those rights were then reiterated in the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. Then in 1968, in the middle of the war into China, the United States created this protocol relating to refugees. And then in 1980, which is really, sorry, I got a message about unmuting myself. So in 1980, the United States incorporated all that into our Refugee Act. And so the law, I don't have any slides, so you're just gonna have to look at me, and sorry. 1980, this legal definition, which comes out of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, is that you have a right to asylum if you have a well-founded fear of persecution because of one of 5 reasons: your race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Most of those are very straightforward. I want to say really briefly, I've been doing pro bono legal services for asylum seekers since the late 1980s. This work has always been difficult. It's always been challenging, and to some extent, it's always been subject to some sort of political influence. But it has never seen the sort of unprecedented attempts to completely dismantle the system of asylum that's worked and functioned since 1980. And I'm going to take a moment to go step by step, because this is a systematic effort by the administration to destroy these rights. Now, it started with a rhetorical war, with the administration using words like loophole and invade and infest and these othering words to refer to asylum seekers, who are, after all, just people coming to the United States because they were forced to leave their home because of persecution for one of those 5 reasons. Then there was the first travel ban, which said that you're barred from asylum if you cross the border anywhere other than a port of entry. And that was followed quickly, and that was challenged in federal court and enjoined. So then they created this system of so-called metering, which was just letting a few people at a day, and sometimes no one, to cross the border, and claiming that they were overwhelmed and unable to administer credible fear interviews, which was complete fiction. We definitely had the capability of doing credible fear interviews with the people that were at the border. We just wanted to discourage it. Then that ended in the second transit ban, which was to say that if you came through any other country or any 2 other countries on their way to the United States, which is people from all of the world. I've represented people from Eritrea and Congo and Nigeria, people from all over the world that traveled in order to cross the American border, and completely legal to claim asylum at the border. And that second transit ban was an effort to eliminate the right to asylum to all of those people. That was followed by perhaps one of the worst human rights responses we've ever done, this ironically or really absurdly named Migrant Protection Protocol, which we call Remain in Mexico, that Dr. Wasenick referred to. And that was, if you want to claim asylum, then you have to wait in Mexico for your case to come up. And then we built these tent courts, these super secret tent courts that very restricted the rights of outside observers, restricted the ability of attorneys to access and represent their clients. Well, of course, we have, my agency's small, we have 15 staff members at the moment, but we have over 300 volunteer lawyers that will take cases like this. But they're unable to do that if people are trapped in Mexico. And in addition to that, how are you supposed to prepare an asylum case when you're trapped in a border town that with, how are you supposed to access counsel? How are you supposed to get the documents, forensic medical examinations? How are you supposed, let's say you're a persecuted Christian from Eritrea. How are you supposed to get copies of your baptismal certificate or any of the evidence that you're going to have to get to court. How are you even going to receive notice of your court date? So obviously, this was intended by the administration to severely restrict the ability of people to access the courts in the United States, access attorneys, and pursue their asylum case. After that, we entered into these so-called safe third-party agreements with Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Well, we got a safe third-party agreement with Canada for many years. Why? Because Canada is a safe third country. And so if you go to Canada, you need to apply for asylum in Canada. But if you travel through Colombia and Guatemala and Mexico to come to the United States and seek asylum, then you're going through countries that are not safe. In addition to that, do not have the infrastructure that we have to adjudicate the asylum cases. And so because of that, we started deporting people who came here to the border, legally applied for asylum at the border. We put them in a detention center and actually deport them to Guatemala to have their asylum cases adjudicated there. Well, Guatemala is not a safe country for Guatemalans, which is one of the reasons so many Guatemalans are coming up here. And as Dr. Wassenich mentioned, they're also in the midst of severe hunger problems as a result of drought, as a result of climate change. And so for the United States, who was historically one of the most welcoming countries in the world to refugees, why? Because that's part of our DNA as a country, to send people to a developing country like Guatemala and pretend that they have greater resources than us to adjudicate those claims is just absurd. Well, it's actually not absurd. What the rationale is that it's intended to discourage people from claiming asylum in the United States. In addition to that, it's important to know that the immigration courts are not part of the judiciary. That surprises a lot of people. Immigration courts are part of the executive branch, which means they are subjected to the political pressure of the Attorney General, who was Jefferson Beauregard Sessions. Now it's William Barr. These are individuals that have inserted themselves into the process and to make it more difficult for asylum seekers. I'll give you one big example. We've seen advocates have been for many years representing women from Central America fleeing domestic violence, because although there are laws on the books protecting women from domestic violence, they're seldom enforced, and women will endure years and years of abuse. Their spouses or partners will actually pursue them in other parts of the country, and they're completely unable to escape. And so finally, in desperation, they come to the United States and apply for asylum. There was case law that developed that protected them. It's the matter of ARCG that said, for instance, if you're a Guatemalan woman who suffered domestic violence and the government can't or won't protect you, and you can't escape your spouse, that's a particular social group that's entitled to protection. Well, the Attorney General did something very unusual. He referred those cases that created that precedent to himself for review and overruled it in the matter of AB. So you have the government, who's the prosecutor. You have the government, who's the judges are part of the Department of Justice. The immigration courts are subject to that authority. And so the government, as the prosecutor, is actually attacking the case law and overruling it that these women have used for their protection. So this was purely intended to eliminate this as a ground of asylum for abused women that have escaped domestic violence. And then I have two more things to talk about. And the next is the administration has used the cover of COVID and had the Centers for Disease Control to actually bar anyone crossing the border, including children and women claiming asylum. So right now, we are turning away children who claim to have been abused or neglected in their home. They have legal protections under trafficking laws in the United States, and we're refusing to let them even come into the United States to pursue that under the cover of COVID. Well, many health NGOs have said this is a completely unnecessary public health. The idea of it being a public health concept is just completely bogus, and there's no real public health benefit to this. So finally, I've saved the worst for last. The administration just announced a set of regulations that, if enacted, and we're in the review period right now, which organizations can submit comments on, which we are doing, and many advocacy organizations in the United States are submitting comments, because this would absolutely destroy asylum as a right here in the United States. We'll be turning our backs on a legacy that goes all the way back to the Holocaust, when the whole world community agreed to the concept of non-refoulement, which is a civilized country will not knowingly return people to harm, which we are absolutely doing right now. And they came out of the Holocaust because the world said, we have the ability, community, to provide refuge to Jews fleeing the Nazis, and we refused to do that. And so millions perished, and the whole world looked at that and said, we're never going to do that again. We're going to establish a right to asylum, and we're not going to knowingly return people to harm, which we are absolutely doing now. I don't have time. I urge you to look at the position papers that are out there in these regulations. But these are some of the things they do. They very narrowly define persecution to not include things like temporary detention. So if you are abducted from your home at night by soldiers and briefly detained in one of these awful African prisons, that's not persecution. Well, that just defies any understanding of how you could say that. Narrowly defining particular social groups to eliminate right to asylum for LGBTQ individuals as, okay, I'll wrap this up. Safe third country agreements. If you pass through other countries even briefly, then you're going to be barred from asylum. And at the same time, we're also limiting the ability of people who've applied to asylum to get work authorization while their cases are pending. So I know that's a lot of negative information. I apologize for that, but it's the reality of what we practitioners are dealing with at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Now that you've riled us all up,
I am riled up.
Yeah, understandably so. Our next speaker is Dulce Garcia, who serves as the executive director of Border Angels, a nonprofit organization that coordinates humanitarian work. And Dulce has been active on behalf of DACA recipients and was part of the suit that ended up in the Supreme Court, who rendered the decision just last week. And we join with Dulce in celebrating this important decision while recognizing that it's not the end of the journey.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for saying that. Yes, we're still celebrating. It's still a high for us to win this case. But you're absolutely right. This is not the end of it. As long as we still keep seeing inhumane immigration policies, as it was explained by the experts before me, we're going to keep going and pushing forward. In particular, because this president keeps pushing for a wall and other cuts to lawful migration, including policies that would affect what he calls chain migration and what we call family reunification, which is, ironically enough, the program that brought his in-laws here. So I think the in-laws ruined it for us, but he insists that we get, all these bad policies in exchange for permanent protections for DACA recipients. And for those of us that live here at the border, we absolutely say no, because we have seen firsthand the consequences of that. Here in San Diego, where Border Angels is, we know that there's already very much the presence of ICE and Border Patrol. So we have a double deportation force. It's very much a militarized home city. We have checkpoints coming in and out of San Diego County. We often get threatened to have the National Guard here by this president and for various reasons. We saw with the protests and the uprising that's happening here in the streets that we have Border Patrol collaborating again with local law enforcement despite California so-called sanctuary laws or SB 54. So it's a very scary time for those of us that are undocumented. And we often say in our DACA movement, we would rather remain undocumented than agree to these policies. So one way to support, before I forget, would be to keep pushing for the Senate to bring to a vote the DREAM Act and Promise Act, which would protect not dreamers, but other undocumented people or TPS folks, because that one has passed in the House, but it's still just sitting there for waiting to be put on the floor for a vote. But here, you're absolutely right with Border Angels. Our mission is focused on, it's based and focused on love, and it's an active kind of love. I do have a trigger warning though for folks, trauma folks. You know, these are not the most extreme of cases. Sadly enough, these are cases that we see all the time. All of the time. And so that's why we feel obligated to bring them up and take as much opportunity as we can, especially in panels like this, to inform people. These are not meant to re-traumatize anyone, but this is the reality that we're living here at the border. We have, my slides are not working here, so I don't know how to switch them. Here we go. We have two programs with Border Angels. One is the Caravan of Love and the Shelter Aid. The Caravan of Love, we started with this more recent caravan that arrived here in our border, where we would line up the cars and take them over across to Tijuana for the various shelters there. As it was mentioned before, these shelters are not government run. These are people that opened up their churches, their homes. Some are somebody's garage that they converted into living space for migrants. And then we have the shelter, where we directly provide assistance to the shelters so that they can buy themselves whatever they need, that they see fit for their shelters. And these are a direct result of the MPP program, which was mentioned before. Again, the MPP program, the Migrant Protection Protocols, which is a misnomer, has resulted in right now in Tijuana, over 16,000 people waiting in about 32 different shelters. And again, these are shelters that are not receiving government help. And so these are shelters that have been supported by volunteers. We have one shelter where the directors work and they use their own earnings to provide food for the people that are living there. Again, people are being told to wait in Tijuana 9 months, 12 months. No one knows where their next meal is coming from. How are they going to feed their children? A lot of them are families. We do see them from all over the world. The more recent arrivals are coming from Eritrea, Cameroon, Haitian, which started even earlier back in 2016. And we're telling them to wait in the most dangerous city in the world, which is Tijuana. Now, as a DACA recipient, I don't know much about Tijuana. I haven't been to Tijuana in over 30 years. And I myself don't know, but I mean, based on the articles that have been out there and the data that's out there and the accounts that we have received from migrants themselves, in particular for Black men, migrants and folks from the LGBTQ community, having to wait in Tijuana, which is one of the most dangerous cities in the world, is actually a lot of anxiety for them, especially when the Mexican authorities have acted as another extension of Trump's deportation machine by questioning often migrants, whether they're from Honduras or El Salvador, and asking them about their papers. And so they do their own immigration enforcement at the border. And that has resulted in so many human rights violations, including the roundup of migrants, including children, and putting them on holds, on immigration holds, until they can clarify and prove that they are able to stay there under the MPP program. So there's obviously a lot of harassment happening also from the Mexican government. Just another warning here. These policies are what has resulted in so much death people are so desperate in what's happening in Tijuana that they try to cross through in between the ports of entry. And so we see an increased number of migrant families crossing in the desert. So another program that Border Angels is known for is dropping water in the desert. We have folks that have been going to the desert every weekend to provide this humanitarian aid. We provide supplies and water for people that are crossing through the desert and through the mountains. Unfortunately, when it's the most extreme of weather is when people think that that's when they have the highest chances of crossing either through the desert or through the mountains, because Border Patrol likes to be comfortable and they don't like to be out roaming. And so when it's 120 degrees, that's when people think that that's when they have the biggest chance of crossing. And we're seeing more and more in the last few years, little baby shoes, diapers, little backpacks, toys, to indicate that we're no longer seeing primarily adult men crossing, we're seeing women and children crossing as well. And this is a direct result, again, of our policies and our denial of these rightful claims to asylum, where people are so desperate that they decide to cross through rivers, like we see on this picture, unfortunately, a toddler, Valeria, who passed away because they couldn't wait after being told that they had to wait months outside of the U.S. for their turn. There is a list that then neither the U.S. government or Mexican government want to take responsibility for, and our friends from El Otro Lado and other organizations had to sue for, because this list that where people self-organize and put in their number, their name essentially to be called next, takes months, takes 9 months to 12 months. And now with the border closed, now that's been shut down as well. And so now that the border is closed, the Caravan of Love has stopped. We're no longer taking donations in caravan style to Tijuana. Only essential travel is permitted, but we're taking very small donations in trips, smaller trips, instead of opening them to the public because of what's happening with COVID-19. One of our shelters, one of the dozen shelters that we support has reported that they have been in isolation because the director tested positive and has been fighting with COVID-19 for a few weeks now. So this is one of our biggest concerns, that we have in these shelters over 100 people, and to require them to wear masks and keep a physical distance between them, to practice social distance, and it's nearly impossible. We're also getting reports of the shelters that are unable to get the food that they need just because there's a short of supply and obviously money. A lot of the organizations that were helping on the ground have left Tijuana. There's only a few of the organizations that are helping monetarily as well. Seeing that the churches, which was have been a big supporter of the efforts in Tijuana, are not able to cross. And so that has been another challenge for the shelters given COVID-19. This is just an example of, this was midway through 2019 that we had these numbers. It's increased quite a bit in the last year. But, you know, there's nothing like going in person and seeing for yourself what's happening down there. Every person that we have been able to take to Tijuana says this is it's life transforming. It's an experience like no other, because you get to see people that are going through such difficult time and yet still very grateful. One of the prior presenters, I think it was Dr. Linda, who mentioned, you know, that as a country, the U.S. is re-traumatizing these folks, and we're, you know, teaching them hate. But at the same time, we see that they have so much gratitude and so much hope with them as well. And we see that with people that are in the detention centers as well. But there's nothing like going for yourself and seeing what is happening. A lot of them live in this way with tents within a building. They don't necessarily have you know, rooms. They sleep on tents. Some migrants are having to sleep on the streets in tents. And For the shelter program, we do provide direct monetary support for them. It's been quite challenging providing this help with COVID-19, but we think we figured out a system that works for all of the 12 shelters that we support. We support 2 in Mexicali as well. There is a big increase of COVID-19 or outbreak in Mexicali, which is very concerning. But we also have a bond program, and we have seen that a lot of folks that were attempted to cross between the ports of entry, meaning they try to cross through the mountains or through the desert, where they're taking months for them to get their parole documents. And now if you get caught in between the ports of entry, you don't even get processed. You get denied, you get turned back, and you get deported. If you're from Cameroon, you might get deported to Guatemala or somewhere else. It's a shame what we're seeing. But we're responding both with the situation in Tijuana. We're going to the desert to provide supplies, also in the mountains. When it gets cold in the winter, we have seen people freeze to death. And we know how important this is life-saving work. And in 2018, the Border Patrol confirmed that there were 281 deaths. I haven't seen them confirmed for 2019. I don't know why they report on all the good work that they do, but they don't report on the deaths. So I'm still waiting for them to report publicly the 2019 deaths. But for fiscal year 2018, there were 281 deaths at the southern border. We think that now it's well over 10,000 deaths that we have seen since Operation Gatekeeper, since the wall went up. So there is a wall here, contrary to what the president thinks. And this is just some of the efforts to try to keep things sanitary in the shelters. We have worked with another organization called Refugee for Health Alliance, and they built water hand washing stations. And so we've been able to support that work as well. We are working with one of the shelters that has been able to expand so that people can have more room, so that all 100 and plus people that are in that little small tiny church can have more space for sanitary purposes. And there's been collaboration with this group of doctors that have stayed in Tijuana and are living in Tijuana for the time being to be able to support what is happening there at the shelters. And here is the shelter expansion, some of the photographs of the project that we've sponsored for them to be able to breathe a little bit easier. There's our contact information. Again, we're doing so much with Border Angels, including bonding people out. The bonds have that ICE places on them for newly arriving or asylum seeking folks is very arbitrary. We have seen women, we saw a woman whose father, husband, and child were killed in front of her, and they were still placing a bond of over $5,000. We saw another man who saw his sister and his mom killed and burned to death in front of him. He was able to escape, and his bond was over $10,000. We've seen folks from, I think it's Costa Rica, the country. There was a gentleman whose bond was placed at $20,000. And so, you know, they're up to $30,000 for folks that have absolutely no criminal history, but arbitrarily ICE places bonds on them. The minimum bond is $1,500, but we haven't seen a minimum bond since COVID-19 started. On the contrary, we have seen an increase on them. The most common one is $5,000, $7,500. And we see them from all over the world, primarily African countries and Southern American countries. So we're doing that work as well in collaboration with other organizations that make part of the National Bail Fund Network. So thank you everyone that's here listening to all of our speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dulce. Can we go back to the continue? Okay. Thank you. That was an extremely inspiring presentation. So far, we've heard from some wonderful speakers about really critical issues, and we Tried to save some time for you, Ed. This is Edward Maybach, a university professor at George Mason, and he's going to talk about the climate change issue and how this intersects with what we've already heard about. He'll speak on public sentiment about climate change and how it has evolved in recent years. You need to unmute, Ed.
Thank you, Kathleen. I am going to endeavor my best to actually give you 3 reasons for hope. But I gotta say, I'm gonna struggle with this just a little. I'm a public health professional. I've worked on some really tough issues in my life. In the past 13 years, I've worked exclusively on climate change. And every single day I think about the prospect of billions of people dying going forward as a result of our climate becoming incapable of sustaining human life in the way it currently does. And I was well prepared to hear Linda and Bill and Dulce's stories, and I knew I'd be hearing trauma and pain and loss and suffering, but I gotta say, you guys have really ripped my heart out. I know Marina was on the call with us earlier, and she had to drop off because she found the conversation to be just too tough to listen to, and I can fully relate to that. But as I said, I'm going to really try here to be to give you some reasons for hope. I really don't know much about migration, immigration, or human rights. I freely admit that. But I do know a lot about climate change. I know a lot about how people, Americans in particular, think about climate change. And believe it or not, there's some real hope there. But before I even talk about climate change, I want to tell you briefly about a survey that my team and I did on COVID-19 in the first week of April of this year. We were sitting, we were doing our day jobs, working on climate change, which is incredibly important, but we were feeling incredibly distraught and impotent about the pandemic raging around us. And we felt that we had some ability to contribute, if nothing else, by conducting a survey to help our public health professionals around the country better understand what was in the hearts and the minds of Americans so that they could do so that to the degree to which their political minders allowed them to do their job well, they at least knew what that would look like. They would know what the public understood about climate change and what they were doing. And one of the questions that we asked people in early April was essentially, when you think about COVID-19, what emotions do you experience? And we had a whole long list of emotions, very similar emotions to what the questions that we ask people when we survey on climate change. And the most prominent emotion that the pandemic evoked in Americans was compassion. Think about that for a moment. Compassion. I find that to be incredibly hopeful. Not fear, not anger, not disgust, but compassion, which goes a long way in helping to understand the other research that we didn't conduct, but was being conducted at the same time, which showed that the best way to encourage people to keep those damn masks on when you go outside is to remind people you're not doing this for yourself, you're doing it for other people. You're doing it to protect your mother or your grandmother or the person who is selling you groceries at the store, or the driver on the bus who is getting you to the store. And that is the best way to get people beyond their inability to comprehend a change in lifestyle, like going outside in a mask, and to motivate them to get used to it, get over it. So that's the first point of hope, is that when we are now in a different world 2 months later, but 2 months ago, compassion was the primary emotion. And I find that very hopeful. The second point of hope is, because we are in a pandemic, because it's really scary, because lots of people are sick and lots of our loved ones have died, it's social scientists like myself have a fairly well supported hypothesis. It's called the finite pool of worry, or the limited pool of worry hypothesis. There's a lot of reason to believe people can only worry about so many things at any one time. And the more we worry about one thing, the less we have the ability to worry about other things. So given that we are living in a time of COVID, my concern, my day job, running the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason, I'm trying to make sure that Americans have an accurate understanding of the magnitude of the threat of climate change, so that they will start thinking deeply about what should we be doing about this? What can we be doing? What are our best options? Not engaged in silly debate about whether or not the climate is changing. So when we conducted our survey, our previously scheduled survey in mid-April on climate change, as we do every mid-April for the past 12 years, I was terrified that what we were going to find was that concern about climate change among our fellow Americans had dropped dramatically. The hopeful news is it hasn't. We have the capability. I'm not saying we have disproven the finite pool of worry hypothesis, but what I am saying, and I'm completely certain of, is Americans currently have the ability to worry about the COVID pandemic and worry about climate change at the same time. And that's really good. And I actually think that maybe that there's a spillover effect of that we might have the ability to keep in mind these stories of these traumatizing situations, these stories of pain and loss associated with people trying to come to America to get away from danger. So the third and the final point of hope. Over the past 5 years, and this is the part I know best, over the past 5 years, we've conducted 10 national surveys about climate change. We do them the exact same way every time. We do them at the same time of year, fall and spring. We have a very good understanding of how Americans think about our changing climate. And we've been doing this, as I said a moment ago, for 12 years now. Over the past 5 years, we've seen a dramatic change, a dramatic increase in the proportion of Americans who are worried about climate change, who no longer see climate change as an abstract, distant threat, distant from them in space, somewhere else, not our country, distant in time, the year 2100, not today, and distant in species, human beings, people, not just polar bears. For the first time, really this year, I can legitimately make the claim that the average American sees climate change as a here, now, us problem, not an which is very concrete, not just an abstract future threat. When you think about politics of an issue, there are always many groups of people, many different points of view about any given issue, but in politics, it's the groups who feel most extremely on one end or the other that animate the issue. On the issue of global warming, our research shows there's 6 distinct groupings of Americans. We call them Global Warming's 6 Americas. I'm not going to talk about the 4 Americas in the middle. I'm only going to briefly mention the 2 Americas at the end, the 2 who feel most strongly about the issue and who are animating this public dialogue, public debate about this issue. One of them is called the dismissive. They are a group of Americans who are well educated, but who, for whatever reason, and I could tell you why, but for various reasons have decided that climate change isn't real, or it's not human caused, or even if it is real and human caused, it's not serious. On the other end of the continuum is a group that we call the alarmed. They feel they are also well educated. They are very certain that human caused climate change is real. They completely understand the nature of this threat, and they are apoplectically concerned. 5 years ago, those 2 audiences, the dismissive and the alarmed, were each about 12% of the American public. So they were at parity 5 years ago. In the intervening 5 years, the dismissive have shrunk by 35–40%, down to about 7%, and the alarmed have more than doubled. In fact, they've almost tripled. They were briefly, just before the pandemic, briefly at 31% of Americans. Currently, it's more like 28%. This is huge. From a public opinion point of view, this is a cataclysmic change in the right direction, showing that Americans are waking up to the cataclysm of the climate crisis. Most of those people, most Americans, not just most of the alarmed, most Americans, a solid majority of Americans want climate action from our government. I'm going to give you just a couple of numbers. Essentially 2 out of 3 Americans want the Congress, US Congress, to do more. That would be 9 out of 10 Democrats, 7 out of 10 independents, and 1 out of 3, 35% of Republicans. So there is clearly a political polarization going on, but that still leaves America, including the incredibly important independent voters, the large majority of them want to see action on climate change. I could give you a lot more numbers about that, but I won't. I'll say that it is a majority, an even larger majority want to see ordinary Americans, and especially corporate America, our large businesses, doing much more to respond to climate change. So it isn't the case that we have an America torn right down the middle. We've got an America that is largely in agreement that climate change is a serious problem. It's a problem worthy of attack. They want to see our corporations, they want to see our government leaders, and they want to see their fellow citizens doing a whole lot more to deal with this. The two major reasons why, there are a whole lot of reasons why people want to see more climate action, but the two major reasons are directly relevant to the conversation today. Because it's the number one reason, the number one motivator is because Americans understand this is the right thing to do for our children and our grandchildren. There's a very strong concern about the notion of doing what's right, and doing what's right, especially in a legacy perspective for the next generation and the generations to follow. The second major motivator is because Americans understand that climate change is harming our health now. There's been a huge awakening about that over the past 5 years. And I was delighted to see that the League's proclamation on it acknowledges the necessity to protect public health from our changing climate. That's a really, can't tell you how smart that was and how happy I was to see that. While America is still politically polarized on the issue of climate change, but much less than you would imagine, there's two more hopeful points I want to make. One is that young Republicans have clearly parted ways with their parents and their grandparents on this issue. Or I should say, they are currently clearly parting ways. Young Republicans are no longer willing to accept the kind of climate denial rhetoric that they hear from conservative elected representatives. They understand the truth. They believe that they are members of the party of ideas. They want to see their party lean in and bring the best ideas forward. And that is a really welcome development. And it's a welcome development that you can see in the rhetoric and the public positioning of Republican leaders, particularly in swing districts. They're backing way away from the climate denial rhetoric in those vulnerable districts because they understand that to earn those young votes, they can't do that anymore. Then let me just end up on one final point, which is that this current election season is the first time in America that climate change is a true electoral issue. And we see it playing out a little bit in the way that I just mentioned, in the fact that young Republicans are no longer buying the climate denial rhetoric, but we see it even more clearly among Democrats, among liberals. We see that this is one of the animating issues in the Democratic Party right now. We, in our April survey of this year, we asked essentially the question, how important will each of the following issues be in terms of deciding who you vote for in the fall? And then when they told us the very important ones, we asked them, which is the most important? Which of these is the most important to you? And among liberal Democrats, the top three issues are environmental protection, healthcare, and global warming. That's remarkable. We've never seen that before. And even among moderate Democrats, global warming comes up as the 7th most important issue. Environmental protection comes up as the 3rd most important issue. Healthcare is the most important issue, with the economy coming in 2nd. So we see it playing out right now in the Democratic primaries. We see the furious positioning between mostly younger Americans and mostly non-white Americans who completely understand the magnitude of this problem, and moderate Democrats, older, whiter Democrats, Joe Biden, not quite as convinced, but not quite as willing to put it all on the line to rise to the challenge of truly addressing the climate crisis. And watching that that jockeying, watching that struggle. This is not trivial by any means. It's not jockeying. It's a real struggle for what the Republican Party stands for and what it is willing to do if it takes back the White House and the Senate. It's actually, from my way of seeing things, a very hopeful development. So compassion, the fact that we can worry about two really important problems at one time, which I hope can extend to a third really important problem, which is solving this migration crisis. And then finally, the fact that public will is solidifying very clearly in support of climate action. And I hope and I believe, based on what I've told you, that political will to do something, to actually put in place climate solutions that are commensurate with the threat is not that far behind.
Thank you so much, Bill, Ed. That was a wonderfully hopeful way to end our caucus, which has touched on some very, very serious issues. And I'm also encouraged by your research about how public attitudes are changing, and the hope is that the public attitudes will change with the compassion growing for a lot of the issues that the migrants are facing as well, and the asylum seekers. And I see that they really are very connected. So thank you very much for this. We are way over time, so I don't think we're going to have time for questions and answers unless I'm getting advice from our technical people that we can continue longer and cover a couple of questions. But perhaps I should just put up our final slide, because I know a number of our attendees will have other caucuses that they want to go to. So please take a look at our climate caucus package, that the resource package that's available. There is a lot of material that's been referred to today, and additional material too. And I also wanted to say, support, if you are so inclined, the League of Women Voters of Oregon's proposed resolution on immigration. And I'll just put that slide up very briefly. This is a resolution that resolutions can be proposed to reaffirm longstanding positions that the League advocates and is consistent, that are consistent with League priorities. And this is one that the League of Women Voters of Oregon has proposed. It will be considered by the Resolutions Committee on Wednesday, tomorrow, and then considered by the full convention at the end of the week. So if you are so inclined, it would be very nice for the voting delegates to be able to support that as well. And with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for coming. Wonderful speakers. I learned a lot, and I hope that our participants felt that it was worth their time. Thank you so much.